It's my pleasure to welcome you to the closing session of our conference from the Palais des Nations, but virtually. For those of you who missed the opening session, my name is David Chikvaidze. I come from Georgia, the country, and as chef de cabinet of the Director General of UNOG, I have another daunting task, this time to moderate the very rich closing session. Behind us are 2 days of extensive and rich discussions across disciplines. The situation is urgent. 21st century challenges are putting a strain on our global governance system. The UN Secretary General put it accurately and bluntly. The planet is broken, he said in his State of the Planet speech. It is not beyond repair, however. We still have a common roadmap, the Sustainable Development Goals. Importantly, mindsets are shifting, and we see how concrete solutions are actively sought and taking shape. The past 2 days, if nothing else, have been proof of this. We have heard discussions on a comprehensive human security agenda, on the potential of innovation to build a thriving and fair economy, as well as on how to move away from defining progress without regard for the planet. We have also heard about new strategies for integrating a variety of stakeholders into decision-making, from the financial world to academia, from civil society and media to youth networks. Leadership must become more inclusive, effective, networked, and honest if it is to rebuild broken trust within societies and among countries. Youth is particularly important. Let's face it, our generation is not leaving the planet or our societies in any shape to brag about. It is the youth of today that must do double duty for our generation and their own. In this closing session, we have 5 thought leaders in the fields of economics and sustainable development, environmental progress, civil society engagement, as well as multilateralism and diplomacy. Our next speaker has had a varied and distinguished career in the United Nations, with his current task being commensurate with the magnitude of the theme of our conference. Undersecretary General Fabrizio Hochschild, Special Advisor to the Secretary General on the commemoration of the United Nations 75th anniversary, organized and led the global UN at 50 dialogue on the theme, The Future We Want and the UN We Need. It has given us unique insight into what the public wants at this challenging time for the world and how we can shape our future together. Many of the UN at 75 findings resonate with the themes of the past 2 days, and they will complement and inspire the outcomes of this project. Fabrizio, we're very sorry that you could not travel to Geneva to be at the opening session, but very much appreciate your being with us today from New York. The floor is yours.
Thank you, David, and it's very good to see you. Thank you for the organizers of this event, and warm greetings to all participants. I really hope everybody is safe and their loved ones too. I'm a little bit grateful that I'm speaking before Jeff Sachs, because I felt very nervous about speaking between Jeff Sachs and Jane Fonda when I don't even have a name that begins with J. So no redeeming qualities against the background of such stars. So I'll be the sort of, the little warm-up band, the plane's off tune before the performance of the stars. By all accounts, our world has been precipitated towards a pivot point by the pandemic. The COVID continues to exact a huge toll on our health systems, on our economies, on our social lives, and on our societies. But it is the most visible of multiple current international crises. Climate change, pollution, destruction of our environment is causing even greater damage both to the planet and to the inhabitants of it. Social inequalities growing worse in 2 out of 3 countries over the past 30 years, rising geopolitical tensions, and the disruption of new technologies are testing the capacities of our institutions. 75 years after the creation of the United Nations, international cooperation is, against this backdrop, arguably more vital than ever. And at the recent General Assembly UN 75 summit, the overwhelming majority of leaders of member states referred to the centrality of the United Nations to address global challenges. And yet, this rhetoric notwithstanding, today, in the words of our Secretary General, we have a surplus of multilateral challenges and a deficit of multilateral solutions. And it's often the political will for solutions rather than the solutions themselves. We know exactly what the solutions are for climate change. We're just not pursuing them with the ambition and vigor required. We see a retreat from multilateralism with the resurgence of superpower friction and rivalry, a rise in isolationism, ad hoc shifting alliances of fragmented groups of like-minded states, and generally also multilateralism fatigue, a sense it's just grown too difficult to get global agreements. We have to acknowledge that the crisis is also due in part to a growing sense that multilateralism has not delivered and is not delivering. There's grave disenchantment in the Security Council, but there's also broader disappointment on the inability of the membership as a whole to move forward with the urgency required, for example, to counter climate change and species depletion. There is a consensus among member states that we need to rethink the way our global institutions work and infuse them with new energy to overcome this dangerous and threatening paradox between a rise in global challenges and a decline in global cooperation. And it's against that background that my office was tasked by the Secretary General to undertake what he termed a global listening tour, to seek fresh guidance, new inspiration from we the peoples, to help us to overcome the impasse at which we now find ourselves. To that end, this year we organized a series of global conversations on, and the title was set by the General Assembly, The Future We Want, the UN We Need. We reached out to peoples across the world, and especially youth, and asked them 4 questions. What are your largest priorities for post-COVID recovery? What are your priorities for the world 25 years from now? What do you see as the biggest threats to the realization of that vision? And what are your expectations of international cooperation and the UN in particular to address any gap between the world you hope for and the world we might get if current megatrends continue? We got feedback from hundreds of thousands of people through thousands of so-called UN 75 dialogues. We got survey responses from 1.5 million people in all 193 member states. We commissioned 2 renowned independent survey companies, Pew and Edelman, to do scientifically sampled surveys as a reality check in 50 diverse countries. And we also reached out to universities and think tanks and used AI tools to read sentiment across many countries. We synthesized these results and have put out a report. So what are the key findings? First, striking against the backdrop of polarization, friction, disagreement, and deadlock here at the UN, across all regions, ages, and social groups, respondents were remarkably united in their priorities for the future, remarkably united around their fears and their expectations of international cooperation. Amid the COVID crisis, the immediate priority, perhaps unsurprisingly, for most respondents everywhere, is improved access to basic services, affordable healthcare, quality education, safe water and sanitation. Perhaps more surprisingly, the second main priority for people post-COVID is greater solidarity, increased support to those hardest hit by the pandemic. And that includes a demand to better tackle systemic inequality. COVID-19 has drawn public attention to its disproportionate effect on the most vulnerable and to the deep inequalities that characterize our world. There is also a related demand to rebuild not with the same economic models, but with one which is much more inclusive. Looking to the future, the overwhelming concern, and this is everywhere, relates to climate crisis and the destruction of our natural environment. And it's very striking that even while fears around public health threats have inevitably grown against the backdrop of COVID, the number one concern throughout the pandemic for the future remained the destruction of our environment and the climate crisis. Other priorities looking to the future include a demand for greater respect for human rights and human dignity, a better processes for settling conflict and tackling poverty. And then there was a lot of prominence on the need to do more about corruption and to generate employment. With regard to perceptions of international cooperation and the UN, over 87% of respondents believe global cooperation is vital to deal with global challenges. And striking is the finding that the pandemic has made people think that international cooperation is even more urgent. 75 years after its findings, 6 out of 10 respondents stated that they believe the UN has made the world a better place. But looking to the future, an even larger majority believe the UN is essentially to tackling the world's problems. And it's striking that the demand for international cooperation, although higher among all groups, is higher among women than men and higher among youth than older people. But the respondents are not looking for the same, and we'd be very poorly advised to derive complacency from these findings. The views expressed are not uncritical of our current form of international cooperation or of the UN. Respondents want to see a UN that better reflects the stakeholders of the 21st century and not just the power holders of the 1950s. They want to see a UN that innovates more and that is not only more diverse, but also more transparent, more accountable, and more effective. They want to see a UN that is less paralyzed by difference and more inclusive. So the world spoke and we listened, and we believe that now is the time to step up action, as the Secretary General has stressed. We need to show the world that the current state of affairs and the aspects of dysfunctionality of our international system is not a given and can be changed with more vision and a greater sense of responsibility towards future generations. All states on the 21st of September met here in New York, and the heads of state adopted a forward-leaning UN 75 declaration, which pledged to tackle many of these issues. Furthermore, the declaration called upon the Secretary General to come back to them with very concrete proposals on how the UN can be reimagined, reinvigorated, and upgraded to meeting today's and tomorrow's challenges. And that work has now begun based on the inputs we've gathered from across the world. So we are doing our part, but we know change depends and begins with all of us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fabrizio. Not too shabby for a little off-key band. And thank you for all these synthesis. The findings of the UN 75 dialogue will be important reference points for the way forward. One of the key insights from this project, as we saw, and from the UN 75 findings, is the need to empower civil society leaders and youth networks. And one of the effective media for creating public awareness is art and culture. And it is precisely in this context that I now have the rare privilege and a pleasure that few people have, unless of course you're presenting the nominees in a major category at the Academy Awards, to present Ms. Jane Fonda. Ms. Fonda, you're not only a megastar, but also a champion for women's rights and education, an advocate for the youth, and a prominent environmental activist whose most recent weekly climate actions in Washington, D.C., known as the Fire Drill Fridays, have inspired widespread participation in a very short time. Ms. Fonda, we're very grateful that you're making the effort to join us from the West Coast of the United States, where it is still quite early, and it is my great pleasure to invite you to address the conference. Please.
Thank you very much, David. I'm really honored to have been asked to speak today on this closing panel. From the invitation, I saw that the conference is meant to forge strategies to promote an integrated approach to human security in a time of the interconnected crises of COVID-19 pandemic and the climate crisis. I think there are 3 other global crises that are actually related to climate and COVID: racial injustice, economic inequality, and the crisis of democracy. And since addressing the climate crisis properly necessitates making deep structural changes in how our societies function, why not do it in such a way that begins to solve all of them together? It's really important, I think, that we understand that the climate crisis cannot be solved sequentially. The climate crisis cannot be solved sequentially. We don't have the luxury to confront the pandemic and then climate. They have to be addressed together with true urgency and in such a way that fosters democracy. And it's too late for moderation. We are very close to an irreversible tipping point with atmospheric warming. There's a new production gap document that shows that between 2020 and 2030, global coal, oil, and gas production will have to decline annually by 11% for coal, 4% for oil, 3% for gas, to be consistent with a 1.5 degree Celsius pathway that scientists are calling for. But instead, government plans and projections indicate an average 2% annual increase for each fuel. We have to mobilize and demand big, bold, brave actions from our leaders. And yet too many of those leaders label those who call for emergency measures as alarmists and say that the measures they demand are too expensive. Really? Too expensive. Well, what is the right price tag then to prevent civilizational destruction and the 6th mass extinction, especially given that scientists tell us we can prevent a lot of that if we act right now? You know, all of us alive at this last moment, when hundreds of millions of lives hang in the balance with every half degree of warming we either enable or avoid. The young activists know this, because it's their future that's been put at risk, right? And we absolutely must not fail them. I want to quote Greta Thunberg. She says, quote, "If the emissions have to stop, we must stop the emissions." To me, that is black and white. There are no gray areas when it comes to survival. Either we go on as a civilization or we don't. We have to change. It would appear that a 17-year-old student with autism has a lot more clarity than a lot of our leaders. Okay, so what needs to happen? Well, think of a pair of scissors, right? For scissors to cut, it needs 2 blades, right? The same is true for the climate crisis. One blade must be investing quickly and robustly in the green renewable energy sector. The other blade must be ending fossil fuels. We can have all the solar panels and wind turbines in the world, but if they keep drilling and fracking, we're not going to make it. The science says we need to stop all new fossil fuels immediately, right away, no new permits. And then we need to immediately begin a phase out of what's already being pumped so that we're at 0 emissions before mid-century. And while we demand that trillions of dollars of stranded assets are left in the ground by the fossil fuel industry, we mustn't allow the workers and communities impacted by this energy transition to become stranded assets. The workers can't be the stranded assets. Federal governments need to work with local governments, labor, environmentalists, and communities to rapidly develop plans for a just, fair transition for the impacted workers and communities as we move to a green energy sector. Now, while much can be done locally, only central governments have the ability and resources to bring the needed investments to scale fast. And we need to ensure the focus is on cleaning up and providing green jobs for the peoples and communities who've been disproportionately harmed by the climate crisis and the pollution from fossil fuels and refineries. The same peoples and communities most harmed by COVID, by racism and poverty. Unlike fossil fuels, solar and wind energy grids can be decentralized, even locally owned, thus achieving energy democracy. And unlike fossil fuels, renewable energy is everywhere. So there's no need for costly wars and invasions. Climate scientists warn that we should not rely on claims that in the future bioenergy with carbon capture and storage will be a solution. Therefore, emergency efforts must be made to bolster and heal the natural systems of carbon drawdown. On land, this means ending deforestation and vast reforestation. It means fundamentally altering our systems of food production from industrial mechanical tilling of monocrops to restorative agriculture, such that soils are once again able to sequester carbon, resist flooding and erosion, and provide healthier food. This would mean the return of family farming and food democracy. Ending fossil fuel emissions and the production of single-use plastics will allow our oceans to heal, which will improve their ability to sequester carbon. Now, the other blade of the scissors, the creation of a vast green renewable energy sector, is a massive jobs manufacturing program, building smart energy grids, electrical vehicles, charging stations, wind turbines. And let's make sure these union or union equivalent jobs go to former fossil fuel workers and to the most disadvantaged by race, poverty, and the COVID pandemic. This can lead to economic democracy. Human rights, local jobs, and diversity are important to think about because currently too many of the big green energy companies involved in mega projects are replicating the same bad behaviors as the fossil fuel industry did. They have weak human rights policies and practices. They look for resources in cheap locations that they can control and ride roughshod over the rights and health of local people. Do you know that currently renewable energy ranks as the third most dangerous sector for people defending their lands? Only mining and agribusiness are more dangerous. Professor Alberto Mataran, a professor of urbanism and land management at the University of Granada in Spain, points out that the renewables industry is increasingly concentrated in the hands of a few. In the wind energy sector, for example, 5 wind turbine manufacturers alone make up more than half of the global market share. And at the same time, workers are increasingly concentrated in those same countries. Of the 11 million green jobs created in 2018, 4 million were in China. And there's Europe, where some renewable energy companies have started moving to countries where labor is cheaper, which means increasing numbers of their green employees are left jobless. The same transparency that is beginning to be demanded of the textile and tech industries with respect to their suppliers should also be demanded of the renewable energy sector. They must respect land tenure, good labor practices, the rights of indigenous people, and must share the benefits of renewable development with local communities, both for the sake of those communities, as well as for their own reputation. Alongside the green energy jobs are the jobs needed to make our countries more resilient in the face of extreme weather events. Retrofitting buildings, strengthening our dams, bridges, roads, sewage and water systems, reforesting, cleaning up toxic sites. And the COVID pandemic has made clear the need to pay attention to the low carbon caregiving jobs, the ones that keep society going when crises hit, often called women's work. No longer should home care, nursing, teaching, childcare, delivery and postal services, restaurant and food service, they should no longer be part of the gig economy. These workers must be shown the respect they deserve And this means they must earn a family supporting wage with benefits and paid sick leave. Now, in my country, the United States, to accomplish all this, it's not a multi-billion-dollar effort. It's a multi-trillion-dollar undertaking. And I'm sure that's close to the truth in other countries. And it means we need to embrace systemic economic and social change and replace our own mindsets. We need to get over the idea that deficit spending is bad right now. You know, Oliver Blanchard, the eminent former chief economist of the International Monetary Fund, is talking about a shift in fiscal paradigm. And Nobel Prize winning economist Paul Krugman says, quote, "The new paradigm suggests that both public debt isn't a major problem and that government borrowing for the right purposes is actually the responsible thing to do. Neoliberalism and austerity must be thrown out. They've had their chance and failed utterly. Climate change in particular is the biggest example of market failure that we've ever seen. We all know that it's not just climate crisis we face an empathy and justice crisis as well. The fabric of our societies is unraveling. So while we move with great speed to solve the COVID pandemic and avoid a climate catastrophe, we need to simultaneously mount an assault on poverty, racism, xenophobia, homophobia, misogyny, colonialism, and despair. And we can do this. As writer activist Naomi Klein says, failure to do these difficult tasks in time is a choice, not an inevitability of human nature. We are not doomed unless we choose to be. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ms. Fonda, for your profound, compelling, and such deeply informed remarks. Thank you very much again for enriching our conference with your participation and your altogether incredibly valuable contribution. Thank you. We're now turning to our two last speakers because Professor Sachs is unable to join us, I'm afraid. They're both heads and representatives of the two organizers, the UN Office at Geneva and the World Academy of Art and Science. It's a pleasure to see you again, Garry Jacobs, for the closing of this virtual discussion. President and CEO of the World Academy of Art and Science, a thought leader and successful social scientist and a management consultant. This project has been one of your major babies, and we look forward to hearing from you a practical synthesis of the conference and what challenges are needed, what changes are needed, and what challenges are in front of us to break through in social progress. Over to you, Garry. Thank you.
Thank you, David. And thank you so much for hosting this conference and partnering with the World Academy and all our partner organizations. Between the first two speakers, we've got quite a challenge in front of us. Jane, it reminds me of when I was a student at Berkeley in the 60s. Already you were talking about what needs to change in the world. And it's very inspiring to hear you so passionately and eloquently laying out to us, in fact, the real changes we need in the world today. We've got a system that's broken, as it's been said, and we've got challenges of monumental proportion. And we have to make changes of such a magnitude in such a short time that has never occurred in the history of the world up until now. And at the same time, we've heard from Fabrizio Hochschild that when he's gone around the world and polled more than 1 million people, that people in all areas of all stakeholder groups, in all ages, occupations tell us we need a change in our multilateral system. So the question arises, question that we're all asking ourselves is, who's going to do this? We know we have to do this. The logic of this is imperative. It's inevitable. But how are we going to get it done? How are we going to change the multilateral system that's governed by its owners, who are nation states, who are actually more accurately the governments of nation states, who get elected by addressing the popular will of their people for what they want at home, not the will of humanity or the world at large? How are we going to change our multilateral system to make it effective on such an urgent basis with such a magnitude of challenges? How are we going to make the UN we want, the UN we need, as Fabrizio has said? When we started this project with UNOG a little more than a year ago, we understood that the challenges confronting humanity today were really unprecedented. We talked about many of these back in 2013 in Geneva with the UN in our first conference, and about the magnitude of the changes possible. How are we going to do it is the question, and where can we make a beginning? We're already, many beginnings are there, but where can we jumpstart this? How can we accelerate this? How can we release the energy and momentum needed for it? I think one of the fundamental assumptions and premises behind this conference is we can't do it by expecting somebody else to do it. We can't do it by expecting the UN system as it is today, which is bound on all sides by its member states and the restrictions and limitations, even just to pull out a budget if anybody does something that's a little out of line. We can't do it based on sole reliance on our national governments, which after all, we have elected. We're going to need to do something else. And in the course of this study, we understood that redefining the multilateral system means not just redefining the way the UN works, not just redefining the way the nation states work in cooperation with each other, but the way we as humanity work. We as a multi-stakeholder global society, from all occupations in all fields of life and all ages, we are the people, and it's going to be we who have to define the way we want the world in future and the way our multilateral system has to work. And how do we give the support necessary the Secretary General is asking us? How do we make the UN and the multilateral system more inclusive, more equitable, more empowered to the multiple stakeholders who have a very limited voice and a very even more limited power in the society today? In working with the UN the last 1 year, I have no doubt about the sincerity of those who are leading this organization, but they can't do it themselves. They need our help. They need our help means they need the help of the whole civil society, the whole voice of humanity. We need an approach that takes a global perspective, not just the perspective of particular countries or vested interests of particular professional groups or business organizations or anything, or age groups for that matter. We need something that's going to not be done by specialists, but it's going to look at things from a multidisciplinary perspective that's going to involve all the stakeholders and all the voices. And we're going to need to do something that builds trust in our institutions, which has been depreciated so much, not just at the national level, in our media, in business, in the international organizations as well, in science itself, which is under siege at this time. How are we going to build that? We're going to have to find strategy for that. And that was the rationale behind this project, to create this, what we call GL21, or the global leadership in the 21st century, not as an organization that comes up with all the answers, but as a platform, as a forum for open debate, to invite the best thinking on what we can do to jumpstart this process. We've involved more than 350 experts, more than 70 partner organizations, about 20 events over the last 8 months. And a lot has emerged. A tremendous amount has emerged. It's only a beginning. We understood when we started this, when we talk about leadership, we're talking about the kind of leadership that exemplifies aspirations, that's constructive, not pessimistic, not blaming somebody else for who's responsible or where the buck stops, that's going to take responsibility to make the changes needed, that is creative, that's adventurous, that starts with right thinking and then translates that into action. As Jane said, we face unprecedented multidimensional challenges today. The irony is, though, at the same time, that we're seeing a willingness for change, which we have not seen in decades. We're seeing absolutely what she said about the neoliberalism has to go, that the government taboo on debt, especially debt if it's going to be for the benefit of the masses, if it's going to be debt for the benefit of the wealthy, that's different. The top 1% or something, that's different. This is all old philosophy, and it's not even science. It's an orthodoxy to support the established what exists today. And we've got to have the courage and honesty to challenge it at its roots. And that's why we start with thought. That's why we start with the theory. That's why we founded 10 years ago a new economic theory group to challenge these ideas. It's funny, isn't it, that when the 2008 financial crisis came, suddenly debt didn't matter. Quantitative easing created $10 trillion in the US alone. Because, why? We had to bail out the wealthy financial institutions where all the wealthy investors had their money. Funny thing, all the theory was just brushed aside again. But then when that crisis was, even though we still had high unemployment, it took 5 years in the US to get the unemployment rate down to a reasonable rate. But as soon as that happened, we got to go back to debt management and everything. And then again, what happened this year when the economy is at stake? It's not the economy of the masses. It's not the economy of everybody. Enough people have lost their homes, and hundreds of thousands, millions have lost their jobs, and worldwide it's about almost 200 million have lost their jobs. What happened to the philosophy then? What happened to the necessity now that we now have people rationally looking and saying, we can double the amount of debt in the US itself, provided that we're not doing it to bail out the past, which is simply unviable, but we're doing it to invest in the future. What do we call it when we borrow money and we invest in their future? We call it investment. We call it asset building. And what are we investing in now? We're investing in the planet. We're investing in the future of our children. We're investing in the education necessary. We're investing in creating jobs for people who really need them. And yesterday we had a wonderful session on employment, providing all the information that shows it's more costly to the society to have an unemployed person than to pay them to work. In terms of crime, in terms of healthcare problems, mental problems, judiciary system, drug problems, and everything else, it's more costly. And what is the cost of leaving a human resource unutilized? How do we measure that? A person who's not allowed to develop, who's not given the opportunities to to develop their knowledge, to develop skills and express them in productive work for their own sake. How do we measure that wastefulness? We need a new type of accounting and all. But how are we going to start this? That's the question. And that's what we tried to address in this conference. We tried to address how do we give the leadership necessary to go beyond what was being done so far. And we don't have to start from scratch. 5 years ago, we had a remarkable example of leadership in the founding and the formulation of the SDGs, an unprecedented act in the history of humanity. And it took us back to another great act of visionary leadership in 1948, when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was framed. in order, at a time when no nation state was willing to sign on the dotted line and say, we're going to enforce these rights and we're going to empower law to enforce these rights. But it was an act of leadership, of visionary leadership, led by Eleanor Roosevelt and others, to get them down. And those rights have now become goals. And formulating those rights and formulating those goals were great acts of leadership and power. When we talk about leadership, we usually think of inspiring individuals, and we've had good examples today of why we do that. A fiery global activist who's dedicated decades not only to outstanding professional accomplishment, but for helping humanity and helping save this planet. And in the last session, a youngster, a Caucasian Basu, who at the age of 12 was elected as global coordinator for UNEP for children and youth, and founded Green Hope Foundation at the age of 16. And in the last 5 years, she's done more public service to the world than most of us have in a lifetime. This is leadership, and certainly we need those inspiring, dedicated, passionate, fiery, courageous individuals. But we need more than that. We need all types of leadership. We need not only the person, but we need the organizations that lead. 1945, the UN and UNESCO were founded. Followed quickly the World Bank, UNDP, WHO, World Food Program, UNEP, UNIFEM, and the youngest of the UN agencies, the Young UN, Agents for Change in 2016. Founding new organizations, creative organizations, has always been a great step in leadership. The Royal Society was the first National Academy of Science in the world, founded in England in 1660. By coincidence, or in 1960, the World Academy of Art and Science was founded by very eminent people who were members of all the academies around the world, because they realized national academies are not enough. We've got to be looking and working on behalf of the whole world and not just at the national level. Organizations of all descriptions, like the National Dairy Development Board, which took India to make it the largest dairy producing country in the world within 5 years, or Grameen Bank, which spread out created microcredit as a global institution after that, or the IPCC that was founded by the UN and headed for many years by one of our fellows, Rajendra Pachauri, Ash Pachuri's father, and then created the POP movement. So organizations are important. We need strategies, effective, dynamic strategies. They can also lead, like the Green Revolution, which doubled the food production in India in 10 years and turned a food deficit, famine-based country into a food self-sufficient country, even in the first 5. We need leadership in the form of plans, like the Marshall Plan was a leading key determinant after World War II. We need leadership in the form of systems and platforms, like the online learning systems like edX and Coursera that were started in the last decade and now give us a head start in moving ahead. We need programs like the school's nutritional programs, and we need new measures and indicators of development, like UNDP's Human Development Index, which was started in the late 80s. And now we have the ESGs today, which are really making an impact on investing, and so forth. We need reports like the Club of Rome's Limits to Growth, and the films like The Inconvenient Truth, and movements like Occupy Wall Street, Me Too, Black Lives, Sunrise, Fridays for Future, Fire Drill Fridays, POP movement, and others. So this is the background for what we had in mind when we started this project with David and the Director General, Tatiana Valovaya. And we have found in our discussions with you ideas, pregnant ideas, powerful strategies that can help us do this in many different ways. In terms of goals, we had our finance group saying we have to make sustainable finance the 18th SDG. We've got to go around and indicate, sustain the way we use our finance itself has got to be one of the critical goals. And that same group has just released a report at our at the conference yesterday, a completely new report. For the first time, the 30 largest among the 30 largest financial institutions in the world have reported how they're spending their money now, how they're investing their money, worth about $100 trillion in total every year, and measured, these companies have revealed to us the data on how far they are actually employing it for ESG, for environment, for society, for governance guidelines. And they're the first to say that it's not all of their money, that they've still got stuff going to the fossil fuels, and they've got to change that, and they've got to shift it more and more. And this is only the beginning. And they want to release this data as a call to their colleagues in other companies, in hundreds of other top financial companies in the world, and asking them, put up your data, show us what you're doing, show the investors what you're doing, and live up and rise up to the role that finance has to play in this economy. Jane spoke about jobs. We had a wonderful session on employment, on the need for job guarantee programs. And we've been studying that it's in this project for years. And we had wonderful testimony from experts, I think beyond a question. We need to and can finance to create jobs for everybody who needs one until the private economy takes over and absorbs them themselves. And the countries will be better off for it financially, will be much better off for it socially, in terms of health, in terms of our democracy. This is a win-win situation, and it's time to be looking at it. It's not a new idea. FDR was looking at it in the early 40s. They were talking about it in 1945. Now is the time has come, that we can act on it. We need plans. We had a Marshall Plan. Now, yesterday we heard the Planetary Emergency Plan produced by Club of Rome with more than 300 other organizations, and the 10 commitments they see are necessary to really manage not just the climate issue, but the problem of economic inequality, which Jane mentioned, and the problem of governance and democratic inclusion that we need. We need new organizations. We need to reorganize our educational research, our scientific research, to break down the disciplinary barriers and get integrated approaches to policy making, to formulation of strategies, and of course to implementation. We discussed it this morning. We need strategies to handle the food problem, which we discussed yesterday, which has reached a critical stage because of the pandemic and is likely to continue, throwing hundreds of millions of people into greater vulnerability and nutritional deficiency now. One of the strategies we talked about many was focusing on regional and national buffer stocks to compensate for the market failures, that whenever there's a short reduction in food production, we have a shocking rise in prices, and who loses the most from that, of course, are those who can least afford to pay more for food. Least afford food. We know the strategies, they're well documented, and they work. We need innovative financial products. We've talked about green bonds for the private and many other new instruments that are being created in the private sector, but we also talked, and we have a project in the academy on this, and it's being listened to very seriously by central banks around the world, creating digital currencies just to finance the SDGs. It's fully feasible, it's affordable, and it will give us the money we need to invest in the future. We'll be investing, and I don't mean just in climate, I mean in the educational system we need. All the research of UNESCO shows that we got an increasing deficit in our capacity to offer higher education to the younger generations who need it. And the cost of higher education in the US is also already so exorbitant, the average student, not even before they graduate, It's got a debt of $30,000 or more, $1.6 trillion in the US alone. We're supposed to be supporting and investing in the next generation and giving them what they need for the future. What could be a more valuable investment? And we can do it. And that's not enough. It's not just a question of money. Even if we had all the money we needed to multiply the number of universities to create a new university the size of Harvard every day of the week for the next 15, 20 years, we wouldn't have the teachers for it. We wouldn't have the quality of educators needed for that. We've got to also think of a global delivery system that can deliver the best quality education to the most at a fraction of the cost of what we have now. And that's one of the favors that the COVID has done. It's forced the universities out of this fear and resistance to the online learning. And I'm not saying that the online should completely replace the classroom learning, but it's forced us to recognize that we can't afford this model anymore. It simply can't meet the needs of humanity. And so we've talked about with experts, we've talked about if you simply did one thing, if we separated certification for education from delivery of education, we would open up the field of education to vast resources, retired professors, people from industry and other fields and professions who are willing and eager to lend their knowledge. And it's the certification institutions that would tell who has the knowledge. And this is already happening. It's happening in the US, it's happening in the UK. The companies themselves are saying, we don't want your degree. We want to see that you're developed as a person with the skills necessary, and your diploma doesn't tell us that you're that person. So these are forms of leadership. They're innovative approaches to leadership. And of course, we need, as Jane represents and POP and others here, the youth represent, we need social movements, multi-stakeholder, multi-sectoral movements that bring us together rather than dividing us and competing with each other. I mean the 350 experts and the 70 partners have contributed rich ideas. We could only touch on a few of them here, and we'll be working on them to refine them based on the wonderful feedback and input we've got from the experts in this conference and coming out with a final report. One part of this project we also agreed on is whatever are our learnings from this project, we will convert it into educational material, higher educational, and then we'll see at other levels. So, because how are we going to prepare the global leaders of the future if we don't take advantage of the latest knowledge we have of what we need to do and know and be different than what we've been learning and what we learned when we went through the educational system. We've got a few more events coming up. Tomorrow, there's an event on lesson of the pandemics in the post-COVID world. What will it be like? Moscow State University, we're partnering on this issue on December 22nd. It's all on our website. We've got, and then a final report. Finally, I'd like to thank the Director General, Tatiana Valovaya, David Chikvaidze. You've been a fabulous partners with us, your whole team at UNOG, who have been so professional. You have kept us running and to rise to the standard, and we've learned a lot in the process of what professionalism is in international diplomacy, and my team is grateful for the education that you've given us there. The moderators for these sessions, the panelists, the 100+ fellows of the World Academy who have participated in the project, and hundreds of other experts, not only our 70 partner organizations, but more than 1,000, we haven't been able to count all of them on social media and all, but more than 1,000 participants in the events. And we're not done yet. We want your inputs, we want your ideas, we want your suggestions. This is a platform. We don't claim to have all the answers. We're asking the difficult questions. We want to hear your answers, and we'll try to process and work on as many of them as we can. And we want your partnership. We need it, because multilateralism, the redefined multilateralism that's really inclusive means it includes all of us. And it includes every organization that can contribute in every field. at every age, even all of us. So with that, I'd like to thank all of you who have participated by your contributions, by your questions, by your listening, and we look forward to working with you in future. Thank you.
Garry, thank you very much. Your statement is so rich, I don't even know which part to thank you for first and how to continue. But I'll thank you for the kind words toward the UN, really rare commodity these days. Thank you very much. We're 75 years after the founding of the United Nations and 60 years after the World Academy of Art and Science was established. And it is indeed time to implement new recommendations for the way forward, including for the United Nations. And thank you. Between Ms. Fonda and your statement, I think you've charted a lot of the directions in which not only what needs to be done, but how to do it. And thank you very much for that. It is at this point that I would introduce the Director General of UNOG, Undersecretary General Tatiana Valovaya, for her closing remarks. As it happens, she's been urgently called away on official travel and is unable to connect with us. However, her remarks, which she updated herself with some major takeaways from the 2 days, are ready for delivery. And in order to walk the talk about involving the young generation in multilateralism, the Director General has asked one of our team members, who has been front and center in preparing the UNOG end of the conference, to read the remarks that the Director General would have presented herself. And I'm very pleased to give the floor to my junior professional colleague, Dorothea Barkstead, who joins us from her native Germany. Dorothea, please.
Thank you, David. It is an honor and a great pleasure to deliver the Director General's closing remarks today. Ladies and gentlemen, it has been a privilege to co-host this conference and participate in such rich and diverse discussions. I would like to thank the World Academy of Art and Science for successful and inspiring partnership that will certainly outlive this project. I share the conviction that hard times frequently inspire extraordinary solutions. The past 2 days are proof of that. We have heard from various distinguished leaders, thinkers, experts, and practitioners in their respective fields. And their inputs have been a great source of lessons learned from the past, but also of innovative thinking and new ideas. I would like to thank everyone for their participation in and valuable contribution to this conference. Let me focus on some key takeaways from these 2 days with the United Nations system in mind. The United Nations system has long been the most advanced international governance model humanity has devised to manage global affairs. However, the world around us has greatly changed over the last decades, and global leadership has not kept up with the pace. The 21st century is marked by a world population soon reaching 8 billion people and a planet that is suffering heavily under the human impact. We live in a highly globalized world marked by inequalities among and within countries. And we are part of unprecedented technological advancement, which have both positive and negative consequences for our collective well-being. These trends are all part of a broader paradigm shift, a systemic transformation that started before the COVID-19 pandemic. As many panelists have emphasized, a new social and economic paradigm is shaping up before our eyes. In this challenging environment, and considering the current deficiencies in terms of global leadership, innovative solutions are required to catch up with the accelerating pace of change and leave no one behind. International organizations are at the heart of the multilateral system, but currently are not entrusted with the required power and resources to effectively tackle the many serious challenges the world faces. Moving forward, various scenarios could unfold, including a return to business as usual or a continued shift towards unilateral actions. However, as this conference has confirmed, there are many forces striving towards a transformed multilateralism. Fabrizio has already spoken about our UN 75 initiative, and I wish to underline 3 points. The findings show that most people are united in a strong desire to find solutions collectively. The overwhelming majority believes in solidarity and sees the United Nations at the center of achieving a better future for all. So, what is the way forward for the United Nations? The pandemic has been a powerful wake-up call. In the thematic discussions, we have heard new strategies for areas such as human security and peace building, the economy and the environment, or financing the SDGs. The Sustainable Development Goals will remain our yardstick for the next decade, and this has been confirmed in all 12 sessions. They are our fundamental framework for addressing human security in all its dimensions and will be key to build back better. Panelists have also repeatedly stressed the social and economic tipping point we are facing and the need for social justice. We must rebuild our society and economy to be more inclusive, equitable, and sustainable. This is fully aligned with the most important priorities of the United Nations, and it is transpired through our UN 75 dialogue. Our international community needs equitable access to global resources, from tangible ones to intangible ones, such as knowledge, information, and technology. Lastly, climate change. It is the defining issue of our time, and it affects us all without exception. Climate change exposes deep inequalities within our societies and threatens the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. It has been encouraging to see how climate action has been a mainstream topic throughout all sessions. As one speaker aptly put it, we cannot rebuild glaciers that have already melted. That leads me to an important point. What are the means to ensure that our priorities are successfully addressed? The UN 75 dialogues have also revealed that many see the United Nations as being too distant from people's lives. We need to provide more entry points for engaging with and through the UN to enhance the trust and public confidence in multilateral organizations. The United Nations needs to be more inclusive. Today, we have heard strong voices of civil society, youth networks, and social movements, especially in the area of environmental protection. We need to build on this momentum. International decision-making needs to include the voices of not only governments, but also of local and regional actors, youth leaders, women leaders, civil society, the business community, academia, and many others. One of the ideas presented during this conference was a global public polling platform. I believe that our outreach in the context of the UN 75 initiative can serve as a good example to take this proposal forward. Many participants in this conference have also called for better interagency coordination, for breaking silos across disciplines, and greater multi-stakeholders initiatives. The most serious challenges ahead of us are transnational in nature. The United Nations needs to foster more network problem-solving approaches that inspire better solutions. So, how could this look in the day-to-day work of international organizations? If we look at the need for more inclusive and network multilateralism, and at the most important priorities for the next decades, we see that International Geneva is well equipped to lead by example and is already doing so. The discussions have mentioned the need for a global platform for action. International Geneva offers an excellent testing ground for global governance innovation. The city is home to the permanent mission of 180 member states, the headquarters of many international organizations, 750 non-governmental organizations, a large private sector, many media outlets, and other actors. The diversity of voices across disciplines, professions, and geographies makes Geneva a unique environment to forge new synergies. In my office, we have set up several initiatives to make UN Geneva more inclusive and open to partners. For example, the SDG Lab, which also participated in a session on SDG financing yesterday, is a platform to connect actors in Geneva and beyond to promote work on the Sustainable Development Goals. Also, the Perception Change Project creatively communicates about the work of international organizations in Geneva. This is extremely valuable to make the UN more approachable and promote the value of our work. Ladies and gentlemen, one important last question remains. How do we create the momentum for visionary leadership for the coming decade? The challenges that our common planet faces are real, and as we have seen in many discussions, the answers really do lie within our grasp. Many of those will be published in the report following our joint project. In this endeavor, we need all hands on deck. to move towards this new form of multilateralism. We also need greater political will, or courage, as one speaker defined it, determination and contributions of member states underpinned by the United Nations system, with participation from all relevant actors and all generations, to keep our promise to humanity. I trust that we can count on all speakers and participants of this event in creating the much needed momentum for change. Thank you very much for your participation and your commitment to global leadership fit for the 21st century. This was the message of the Director General. Thank you very much. Over to you, David.
Thank you very much, Dorothee. May your excellent delivery of the Director General's remarks be a harbinger of your long and successful career, and I want to thank you for your hard work. Ladies and gentlemen, it's been a pleasure to chair this final session. Our two-day conference was attended by over 800 participants from about 100 countries. Yet we're not at the end of the joint project. The final phase starts now, a report with catalytic recommendations which analyzes the outputs of this one-year journey. In closing, I would like to thank our partner, the World Academy of Art and Science, for this successful and truly collaborative partnership. I'd like to recognize the team that worked with Garry Jacobs, first and foremost, his trusty vice president and my friend Donato Kinniga-Pasigli, as well as Mila Popovic, Vasuji Balaji, Vani Senthil, and their colleagues, the unsung heroes in Pondicherry, India, who helped make these 2 days work without a hitch. Actually, it worked like a Swiss watch. I also wish to thank my team, headed by Philippe Baudin-Oyac, Lydia Grigorieva, Dorothee Barkstad, whom you've all met, and Nathalie Deroudet. They all went above and beyond reasonable hours and effort. Special thanks to my young, talented colleague, Esther Capelli, who worked her creative magic on the program, the list of participants, and all the social media. And last but not least, I wish to thank the Director General, whose unwavering support for this project and her trust in her team allowed us, in partnership with our World Academy colleagues, to actually pull off this caper. This will certainly not be our last joint project. Thank you all very much.